Imagine driving down a quiet road late at night with your closest friends in the car. Just minutes later, two people are dead, one person survives with serious injuries, and the driver is accused of planning the entire crash. Was it a tragic accident caused by reckless driving, or was it an intentional act of murder? This is the story of Mackenzie Shirley, a case that shocked America and sparked one of the biggest debates in modern true crime. A single crash became the center of an emotional courtroom battle, raising difficult questions about intent, evidence, and justice. Even years later, people continue arguing over what really happened. Let's examine the evidence, the investigation, and the controversy behind one of the most talked about criminal cases in recent history, the night everything changed. Every true crime story has a single moment that changes everything. For this case, that moment came in the early hours of July the 31st, 2022, in the quiet city of Strongsville, Ohio. What started as an ordinary summer night for three young friends would soon become the center of one of America's most debated criminal cases. Inside a Toyota Camry were Mackenzie Shirley, Dominic Russo, and Davian Flanagan. Like countless young people enjoying a late-night drive, they set out with no indication that their journey would end in tragedy. As the vehicle traveled through a residential area, surveillance cameras later captured it moving at an extremely high speed. Within moments, the car left the roadway and slammed directly into a commercial building. The collision was catastrophic. The force of the impact caused the vehicle to burst into flames, leaving emergency responders facing a devastating scene. Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan suffered fatal injuries and were pronounced dead. Mackenzie Shirley survived but sustained serious injuries and was rushed to a nearby hospital for treatment. In the hours that followed, police initially approached the incident as a tragic traffic accident. High-speed crashes involving young drivers, while heartbreaking, are unfortunately not uncommon. At first glance, this appeared to be another case of reckless driving ending in unimaginable loss. However, as investigators began collecting surveillance footage, examining the crash scene, and reviewing the vehicle's physical evidence, they noticed details that seemed unusual. Those findings raised a difficult question that would soon dominate headlines across the country. Was this simply a terrible accident caused by excessive speed, or did the evidence point to something far more deliberate? That single question transformed a routine crash investigation into a nationally watched murder case, one that would divide legal experts, the media, and the public, and continue to spark debate long after the crash itself. Why investigators became suspicious. In the hours after the crash, investigators began the painstaking process of reconstructing exactly what had happened. At first, the evidence appeared to describe a tragic high-speed collision, but as experts examined the scene more closely, several details stood out and prompted investigators to look beyond the possibility of a simple accident. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras became one of the first key pieces of evidence. According to prosecutors, the video showed the vehicle traveling at an extremely high speed in the moments before impact. Investigators also reported finding little evidence that the driver had made a significant attempt to brake or avoid the collision before the car struck the building. Crash reconstruction specialists analyzed the vehicle's path, the damage caused by the impact, and other physical evidence left at the scene. At the same time, detectives reviewed witness statements, digital records, and communications connected to the people involved. Their goal was to understand not only how the crash happened, but also whether there was any evidence suggesting it had been intentional. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors argued that the totality of the evidence pointed toward a deliberate act rather than a loss of control behind the wheel. The defense, however, strongly disagreed. They maintained that a high-speed crash, even one with devastating consequences, does not automatically prove intent. According to the defense, investigators were drawing conclusions about the driver's state of mind, without direct evidence such as a confession or an eyewitness account. This disagreement became the heart of the case. Was the available evidence enough to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt, or did it only demonstrate reckless driving with tragic consequences? That question would shape every argument presented in court and ultimately determine how this case would be remembered. Inside the courtroom, as the investigation came to an end, the case moved into the courtroom, where every piece of evidence would be examined in detail. What had begun as a fatal car crash was now being argued as a murder case, drawing national attention from legal experts, journalists, and the public. Prosecutors built their case around surveillance footage, crash reconstruction analysis, physical evidence from the scene, and digital records. They argued that the combination of these factors showed the collision was not an unavoidable accident but an intentional act. According to the prosecution, the vehicle's speed, its path, and the absence of significant braking before impact supported their theory that the crash had been deliberate. The defense challenged those conclusions at every stage. Defense attorneys argued that there was no confession, no eyewitness who could testify that the driver intended to cause the crash, and no direct evidence revealing what was in the driver's mind during the final moments before impact. They maintained that while the crash was undeniably tragic, recklessness alone should not automatically be interpreted as proof of murder. One aspect that made the proceedings especially unusual was that the case was decided in a bench trial, meaning the verdict would be reached by a judge rather than a jury. This placed even greater emphasis on expert testimony, forensic analysis, and the legal standards required to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, both sides presented competing interpretations of the same evidence. The prosecution argued that the evidence formed a clear and convincing picture of intent, while the defense insisted that the same evidence could also be consistent with a catastrophic loss of control. As the courtroom arguments concluded, everyone awaited the judge's decision, a ruling that would become one of the most debated outcomes in a modern true crime case. The verdict that divided the internet. After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, and legal arguments, the courtroom finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for, the verdict. It was a decision that would immediately spark nationwide debate and continue dividing public opinion for years. After reviewing all of the evidence presented during the bench trial, the judge found Mackenzie Shirla guilty on multiple counts, including murder. In the court's view, the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the verdict marked a dramatic turning point in a case that had already captured national attention. Following the conviction, the court sentenced Shirla to a lengthy prison term. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan, the ruling represented a measure of justice after the devastating loss of 2 young lives. However, outside the courtroom, the reaction was far from unanimous. Across social media platforms, news outlets, and legal discussion forums, people debated whether the evidence truly proved intent. Some believed the surveillance footage, crash reconstruction, and forensic findings strongly supported the judge's conclusion. Others questioned whether the prosecution had met the exceptionally high legal standard required to prove someone's state of mind beyond a reasonable doubt. Legal analysts also discussed the broader implications of the case. Could an act of extremely reckless driving, under certain circumstances, legally be treated as intentional murder? Or did this verdict expand the boundaries of how intent is interpreted in criminal law? Those questions fueled countless online discussions, podcasts, documentaries, and television segments. Even years later, the case continues to divide opinions. While the court reached its legal conclusion based on the evidence presented, the public conversation remains active, making this one of the most controversial and widely discussed true crime cases involving a fatal vehicle collision in recent American history. Public reaction and media attention. The judge had delivered the verdict, but for many people, the debate was far from over. Almost immediately, the case spread across social media, news channels, legal podcasts, and YouTube. Millions of people began asking the same question: was justice truly served, or would this case remain one of the most controversial verdicts in recent memory? Supporters of the court's decision argued that the evidence presented during the trial, including surveillance footage, crash reconstruction, and forensic analysis, supported the conclusion that the crash was intentional. They believed the verdict reflected a careful review of the facts and provided justice for the families of Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan, who had lost 2 young lives in a devastating collision. Others viewed the case differently. Some legal commentators and members of the public questioned whether the available evidence could conclusively prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. They argued that determining a person's state of mind in the final moments before a crash is one of the most difficult challenges in criminal law. As a result, the case became a major topic of discussion among attorneys, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. The story gained even more attention through documentaries, television programs, and online investigations. One of the most widely discussed productions was The Crash, which introduced the case to a global audience and renewed public interest. Viewers revisited the evidence, compared expert opinions, and debated whether they agreed with the court's conclusion. Years after the crash, the discussion continues. While the legal proceedings reached their conclusion inside the courtroom, the conversation outside it has never truly ended. The Mackenzie Shirley case remains a powerful example of how a single event can divide public opinion, influence media coverage, and leave lasting questions that continue to fascinate true crime audiences around the world. What this case teaches us, beyond the headlines, courtroom arguments, and public debate, the Mackenzie Shirley case leaves behind lessons that reach far beyond a single criminal trial. It reminds us that every decision made behind the wheel carries real consequences, and in just a matter of seconds, lives can be changed forever. The case also highlights how modern criminal investigations have evolved. Today, surveillance cameras, digital records, crash reconstruction technology, and forensic analysis allow investigators to examine events with remarkable detail. These tools can help authorities piece together what happened before, during, and after a collision. However, even with advanced technology, determining a person's intent remains one of the most difficult challenges in the justice system. Another important lesson is the difference between reckless behavior and intentional criminal acts. In many cases, courts must evaluate not only what happened, but also whether the available evidence proves what a person intended to do. That process requires careful examination of the facts, expert testimony, and the legal standard of proof. As this case demonstrates, those questions can lead to strong disagreements, even after a verdict has been reached. Perhaps the most important lesson is that behind every headline are real people, whose lives have been permanently affected. Two young men lost their futures, their families experienced unimaginable grief, and everyone connected to the case continues to live with its consequences. While public debates often focus on legal arguments and media coverage, the human cost should never be forgotten. Whether someone agrees or disagrees with the court's conclusion, this case serves as a reminder that the justice system is tasked with answering incredibly complex questions based on evidence presented in court. For many people, the legal case may be closed, but the conversations, the lessons, and the search for understanding continue long after the verdict, making this one of the most discussed true crime cases of recent years. Conclusion: the Mackenzie Shirley case is more than the story of a devastating car crash. It is a case that continues to challenge how people think about justice, responsibility, and intent. What began as a tragic collision on a quiet road eventually became one of the most closely followed true crime cases in the United States, raising difficult legal and moral questions that still spark debate today. Inside the courtroom, the judge reached a legal conclusion based on the evidence presented. Outside the courtroom, however, the conversation has never truly ended. Some believe the verdict reflected the facts and delivered justice for the victims and their families. Others continue to question whether intent can ever be proven with complete certainty in a case like this. Those differing opinions are part of what has kept this story in the public eye long after the trial concluded. Regardless of where people stand, one reality remains unchanged. 2 young lives were lost, multiple families were forever affected, and a single event altered the futures of everyone involved. Beyond the legal arguments and media attention, that human tragedy is the most important part of this story. Cases like this remind us that the justice system is often asked to answer incredibly difficult questions using the evidence available. It is a process designed to seek the truth, but some cases continue to generate discussion even after a final verdict has been reached. As you reflect on everything you've heard, consider the evidence, the legal arguments, and the court's decision. What conclusions do you draw from this case? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below, keeping in mind the real people whose lives were forever changed. If you enjoyed this evidence-based true crime documentary, Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.